everyone's doing well. You are seeing my first appearance as a dad of 3 instead of just a dad of 2. William, you print the quotes, Liam Corey Miller has been born. He is, as of recording this, 5 days old. When you see this, he'll be 6 days old. And we are very excited to have him in our family. Tired, but still very excited. Yeah, it's been a little bit of a roller coaster ride, a little bit of stress, but we're ready. We had a good Thanksgiving. I hope you guys did too. And as we gear up towards Christmas, I hope that we can continue just to stay safe and love each other as much as we can. Let's get into today's lesson, though. So, one of my my favorite Pixar movies. I know we're getting to Pixar. One of my favorite Pixar movies is Inside Out. I think it's just a fantastic movie. I love it for a lot of different reasons. First of all, it's very creative. Who would have thought about a movie where emotions, have emotions? Like, and who would think that would then be a good movie? It's just sort of interesting. And it's really good. And I don't know how the guys at Pixar do that, where they could take a movie about emotions and make it a good movie. But they did, and their storytelling skills are insane, and it's just awesome. The other reason why I really like Inside Out is that all the emotions learn how to play a specific role in Riley's life. And they have to work together in unity to get things done. By the end of the movie, happiness, sadness, anger, disgust, and fear are all unified. And they're working together to help Riley succeed. You even see some of her memories aren't just happy or just sad, but some of them are a mixture of different things, because we realize that our emotions aren't always going to be just one thing. It can be a combination of stuff. So today we're going to spend more time talking about unity and why it's important for your soul. Before we do that, though, let's kind of recap the past couple of weeks here. So week 1, we talked about the Sabbath. Saying about how, my soul finds rest in God alone. That was from Psalm 62. Or in week 2, we talked about ownership. A healthy soul requires work. That we really touched on Psalm 119. So we're going to start, back at the beginning of creation. God had just finished creating everything, including Adam. Life was perfect. And I mean actually perfect, not that metaphorical perfect. Sin had not entered the world yet, and God literally walked in the garden with Adam. There was no sickness, no death, no wild animals at this point, no fire ants or mosquitoes to bite you or anything like that. Nothing could have been better at this point in life. But then God looked at Adam and said something that was pretty interesting. So in Genesis 2:18, he says, "Then the Lord God said, 'It is not good for the man to be alone. I will make a helper corresponding to him.'" And it's crazy to think about how good Adam had it. Yet God still looked at Adam in this perfect world that he had created for him and said, "It's not good for you to be alone." This verse can really teach us a lot about the values of community and companionship. God had already made plants and animals and fish and birds and trees and stars and mountains and rivers. Made all of these things and everything that we're living in harmony with one another. But God looked at Adam's life and knew he needed another human being to be united with. So God goes on to create Eve, and she becomes Adam's wife. And there's a lot that we could say about when it comes to relationships, especially husbands and wives, but that's a message for another time. We don't want to get into that today. So let's, don't ignore this or turn it off. I'm not talking about that. From the very beginning of time, God said that humankind needed community. Our souls need to be relationship with others, because healthy relationships help keep our souls healthy. There are a lot of examples, in King David, that shows how healthy relationships kept David's soul healthy. The first example is David's best friend, Jonathan. Their friendship is really unique because Jonathan was actually King Saul's son and the Prince of Israel. Jonathan was in line to be king after Saul, not David. And King Saul was one of those guys who was constantly worried about what other people thought. He actually worried about it so much that he failed to follow God. This caused major problems for Saul, and the whole country of Israel suffered because of it. So after David killed Goliath, King Saul made David a commander in his army. God had blessed David, and he became an extremely successful warrior. And one day, after a celebration of his most successful battle, King Saul heard some women saying basically how amazing David was. Basically David had a fan club, and the king didn't. Remember how insecure Saul was here? So you can imagine how jealous he then became of David. So over time, that jealousy grew and grew until King Saul despised David so much that he tried to kill him. While all this is going on, David and Saul's son, Jonathan, had become best friends. So now there's really kind of some irony here and a little bit of awkwardness going on. Imagine your best friend's dad wanting to kill you. Basically, that's what's happening here. But this didn't stop King Saul from wanting to kill David. So finally, King Saul started making attempts to kill David, and David knew that his only option was to just run away and get away from him, for his life. So he sought help from his best friend Jonathan, and which is just, again, his would-be murderer's son. But once Jonathan realized that his own father was trying to kill his best friend, his heart was crushed. Jonathan knew that their friendship would be over because of King Saul. But if you look at some of the last words Jonathan spoke to David, so in 1 Samuel chapter 20, verse 42, it says, Jonathan then said to David, Go in the assurance the two of us pledged in the name of the Lord when we said, the Lord will be a witness between you and me, and between my offspring and your offspring forever. Then David left, and Jonathan went into the city. Jonathan didn't only say the right things. He actively helped David get away from his deranged father. Here's a quick question for all of us. Are you the kind of friend who only talks, or do you actually help your friends out when they're in need? Obviously, it's important to say the right things, but we also need to look out for our friends when they need it. David's friendship with Jonathan shows us that real friends look out for one another. Jonathan and David were united in their friendship. And Jonathan's decision to help David not only went against his father, but also really went against the king. It's not just going against your dad. It's going against the ruler of your country. If King Saul would have found out about this, he possibly would have had Jonathan killed for letting David go. And if Jonathan knew this, and he was willing to accept this punishment because he valued his friendship with David even more than that. So think about your friends right now. If you knew someone was going to try to kill your friends, what would you do? More than likely, you would do your best to help them, right? At least I hope so. But most of us aren't going to be faced with that kind of scenario. Hopefully. Hopefully. But what about the everyday life stuff? What about, are you helping your friends the way that Jonathan looked out for David? Are you willing to listen to your friends? Are you willing to look out and help them out, even if it's not convenient for you? That's what real unity of the soul looks like. David had another solid friend named Nathan. Nathan was a prophet of the Lord. A prophet was really a person who spoke directly to God, and it was the prophet's responsibility to share that message from God with the rest of God's people. So several years after Jonathan helped David, run from King Saul, David became king of Israel after Saul and Jonathan were tragically killed in battle. So one evening, while David was on the roof of his palace, he saw a beautiful woman bathing. And sometimes when I hear this story, I think to myself, why wasn't she inside taking a bath? Or where were her shower curtains? It might sound weird, but actually during that time in history, people often took baths on their rooftops during the evening hours. The evenings are cooler, and it's nice to take a bath after a long, hot day of work. So King David saw this woman bathing, and he totally just lusted in his heart for her. And even though she was already married, that didn't stop King David from wanting her. After all, he's the king, and he could pretty much do whatever he wanted to do. So he invited Bathsheba, this girl, up to his palace, and then King David, the so-called man after God's own heart, committed adultery with her. And they say hindsight is 20/20, but even David should have seen that this was just not a good idea. This is a bad thing to do. David's arrogance and his lustfulness made God angry. David tried to fix his mistake, instead of going to God for help, and ultimately he ended up making more bad choices. So quick question for you guys. Has any of you ever just made a mistake and then you tried to cover it up and it just made things worse? That's exactly what happened with David. See, in the end, David essentially had Bathsheba's husband executed on the battlefield while trying to make it look like an accident. And after her husband was gone, David then took Bathsheba as his own wife. Bad thing to do. And really, we think our lives are dramatic, and then we go, holy cow, this is insane. David is generally considered one of the heroes of the Bible, right? Like, when you think of, Jesus is a descendant of David. So, yet, here is the story describing exactly how terrible David behaves while he's the king of God's people, no less. Oh man. So, before we move on, it's important that we stop and talk about mistakes. Who hasn't done something that they regret? So, part of David's story is how God used him in spite of his mistakes. I really want you to hear this clearly here. God can do the same with each of us. God specializes in turning our mess into his messages of hope. Maybe today, you're feeling totally worthless and unlovable. The good news of the gospel is that Jesus came to save sinners. Especially the worst of us. God did end up redeeming David's story. The interesting thing is that God actually used a friend, named Nathan, to speak into David's crazy life. So, in 1 Samuel chapter 2, verse 7 and 9, it says, 2 Samuel chapter 12, verses 7 to 9. And it says, Nathan replied to David, "You are the man. This is what the Lord God of Israel says. I anointed you king over Israel, and I rescued you from Saul. I gave your master's house to you and your master's wives into your arms. I gave you the house of Israel and Judah, and if that was not enough, I would have given you even more. Why then have you despised the Lord's command by doing what I consider evil? You struck down Uriah the Hittite with the sword and took his wife as your own wife. You murdered him with the Ammonites' sword." So when Nathan learned about all that King David had done, he went to him and called him out. He said, "Why did you despise the Lord by doing evil? Why did you do these things that he considers evil?" Nathan knew King David, and he knew that what he was doing wasn't pleasing to God. Real friends have your back, which also means friends recognize failure. You need friends in your life like Nathan. A friends who will look out for you and recognize you to grow in your faith. And really encourage you to grow in your faith. Sometimes we need people to recognize our failures and encourage us by just calling out our mistakes. Paul talks about this very thing in a letter he wrote to the church in Galatia. So in Galatians 6, verses 1 to 2, it says, "Brothers and sisters, if someone has overtaken any wrongdoing, you who are spiritual, restore such a person with a gentle spirit, watching out for yourselves so that you also won't be tempted. Carry one another's burdens. In this way, you will fulfill the law of Christ." This is what it means to have unity in your soul with each other. Even when you need to tell someone a harsh truth, you do it anyway because you care about them on a deep, soulful level. So think about the words of this passage. Share each other's burdens, and help that person. Our souls are meant to have community with others, and part of this community is challenging each other to be like Jesus in all areas of our lives. Nathan was this kind of friend for King David. He had made some terrible decisions that he thought could just fly under the radar, but Nathan came to him and just called him out. But he did so in love. Nathan told King David something that we all need to hear. God has something better for you. We're all guilty of making bad decisions in the heat of the moment without thinking, about the consequences. And sometimes, we make selfish decisions that cause other people pain. During these times, we need friends to help us. So here are a few practical steps that you can take just today. How can you be Jonathan to those around you? We all want more friends like Jonathan, but how many of us are willing to become that kind of friend? What would it take for you to become more selfless, a better listener, and more sacrificial in your friendships? Really an even braver step might be to just ask a friend this question: do you think I'm a good friend? And then be ready to just humbly accept some criticism that might be coming your way. Next thing to consider is, how can you be a Nathan to your friends? Is there someone who's stuck in sin and needs to be shown God's plan for their lives? Think about Paul's words in Galatians 6. If you feel like you need to correct someone, you better make sure you're doing it with gentleness and humility. Otherwise, it's not going to work. Let's all consider the possibility that each of us needs to be corrected and rebuked like David. Maybe today's the day that God finally breaks through and teaches you that valuable lesson that his ways are better than your ways. We all tend to make a mess of our lives. That's pretty normal. And God's grace is the only thing that can put it back together. Don't be frustrated when a friend tells you the hard truths about your life. That's a real friend who only wants what's best for you and what's best for your soul. So I hope that you guys are doing well. I care about you guys a lot. I love you guys. Pray for me. Again, being a dad of a 6-year-old, a 4-year-old, and now a 6-day-old is tiring. Rewarding, but tiring. So I'm praying for you guys. You please pray for me. I hope you guys are having a good day, good Sunday. I hope you have a great rest of the week. It's December coming up. It's crazy. So I'll talk to you guys later. Bye.